Let's talk about our lab notebooks. In the lab, we have to keep a record of everything that we do, and we do this in our lab notebook. Now, in a research environment, the lab notebook is a lot more open-ended than in a teaching lab. In a teaching lab, we are working from prescribed protocols where you're given either a document or a whole lab manual where we have a whole bunch of information written out for you, and then we want you to translate that into your lab notebook. So we're going to take a look at how we go from one of those protocols to our pre-lab setup, because it's really important to be prepared before we walk into lab. And then once we have our pre-lab set up and we start doing our experiment, what does it look like when we record our data? And then as we train you in the lab, in the teaching environment, we do start to move into some more open-ended experiments where instead of giving you a very detailed prescribed protocol, you might have to develop something on your own. And how does that look? How do you set up your notebook if you're not given something that's detailed out? All right. But before we go into all of that, let's first think about why we keep the notebook in the first place. Okay, so what is the purpose behind the lab notebook? Why can't I just, I don't know, grab a stack of Post-its and just start sticking them everywhere? Or get some loose leaf paper? Why do we keep an actual notebook? All right, before we fill in these bullet points, I want you to pause the video and I want you to think about this for yourself for a moment. Jot down some of your own ideas. Okay, so what's the purpose here? Why are we keeping this lab notebook? Okay, well, one very obvious reason is we want to keep a record of everything we do in the lab. Okay, we want to keep a record of what we do in the lab. Okay, but again, why can't I just, have loose leaf paper or Post-its or, I'm by the balance and I just jot something down on the way paper or the Weibo? Why can't I do that? Why do I have to keep it all in the notebook? Well, the notebook lets us keep everything in an organized fashion that's easy to find later. So we're keeping everything all in one place in an organized fashion. Okay. Now, why is it important that we keep it all in one place? Why is it important that we keep it organized? Well, when we're all done with an experiment, if it's a teaching lab, we have to write up a lab report. And if everything's scattered everywhere, is that lab report going to be very easy to write? Probably not. And if we're in a research environment, well, we don't necessarily write up a lab report, but we do write papers. And if everything's scattered everywhere, is that paper going to be very easy to write? Are you going to be able to put all the data in there? No. Okay, so we do this so that we have basically a one-stop shop where we can go back to everything later. And if we are in a research environment, so that we can leave our data behind for others. So one place. And when I did research for years, I didn't get to keep any of those notebooks. They're all left behind in the lab that I worked in. And I actually just spent a summer doing research again. And this notebook right here, it's at home with me right now because I'm using it to write stuff up before the end of my summer program. But when the program ends on Friday, I don't get to keep this. This stays in the lab. Everything that I did, the entire record of what I have done in the lab for the summer stays in the lab. Because what if somebody needs that data in the future? They need to have it easily accessible. Okay, so we're going to keep that record. We're going to keep everything in one place in an organized fashion. We're going to keep everything in one place where we can find it later or other people can find it later. Okay, and I'm going to leave this last one blank. So some of you may be finding this from the random internet, so fill your own in there. Some of you may have me for a class. And one of the first things that we're going to do when we discuss, lab stuff in person when I finally see you is we're going to fill in that fourth data point. We're going to, put some stuff up on the board because I want to hear from the rest of you. I can tell you until the end of the day everything I know about keeping a lab notebook. But as you're learning to keep a lab notebook, I want us on the first day to write down some of our own thoughts as a class about why we think, other than these reasons here, we keep the lab notebook. And then at the end of the semester, we're going to revisit that and see if your understanding of the lab notebook has evolved from day one till the end of class. So we are going to fill this in as a class. Okay, because I do want you to think about that from day one to the end. What have you learned about this? All right. Okay, so now let's take a look at one of these protocols. Okay, so here is the first couple of pages of a lab protocol. This is actually a lab protocol that I did during my summer program. It's been a really long time since I've been given a lab protocol like this and had to do something like a student. But what it did was it gave me a good exercise to try to figure out, all right, well, how do I go back and retranslate how to tell all of you, what to do from these? So let's take a look here. All right, so this is the first part of the protocol. The first part of the protocol typically goes through some background information. It's going to talk about basically why we're doing what we're doing. So there's an objective here, okay? We are going to make porous silicon using photoelectrochemical etching. Okay, that's a really big word. What does that even mean? Well, I know what that means, but maybe you don't. Maybe you're reading through your lab protocol and you go, what on earth is photoelectric what? Huh? Now, sometimes in the lab protocol, things like that might be defined, but sometimes they're not. And so as you're doing your first read through, all right, you can start to pick out some of those words. Maybe you highlight crazy things that just don't make sense to you so you can look them up later, all right? So when you first start looking, you want to do a first pass. Okay, the first pass, you want to read it and note okay, read it and note anything confusing. Now, this is more than just the background, too. As you read through the rest of it, as you read through the actual experimental protocol, too, where it tells you do this, then do that, followed by whatever, note those things down, all right? Do this first pass. And again, this could be something that you note in the margins. This could be something that you highlight, all right? And then as you read through it, maybe it's explained a little bit more, but maybe not. But if you haven't noted or highlighted, generally speaking, if you are in a teaching lab, what's going to happen is your instructor is going to give a pre-lab talk. So you do read through all of this before you come to class. You prep your lab notebook before you come to class. But then there's a pre-lab talk where your instructor is going to, go through some of the stuff. Now, there are things that maybe we already know are typical questions from students, but maybe you have a question that isn't addressed in your pre-lab talk. And if you, on this first pass, have noted or highlighted anything confusing, when the pre-lab talk is done, typically an instructor will say, okay, does anybody have any questions? And you can raise your hand and you go, yeah, Professor so-and-so, didn't it define photoelectrochemical? And I didn't find anywhere in the lab manual. Could you explain what that term means? And because you've already made a note of that, you know to ask that question, okay? All right, So typical lab protocol, you're going to have this objective, you're going to have some background, there might be some diagrams. Typically speaking, we get our information from all sorts of different places too, and so there might be some references after that background section, because it's really important in science to cite where you get your information. We don't all just pull it out of a vacuum. You want to make sure you're giving credit to people. Okay, so we've got a title, we've got an objective, we've got some diagrams, we've got a background, we've got these references. Okay, all right, and then going forward, okay, we've got some more references. This one had a lot of references to it. And then you might see some supplies, some safety precautions, and then the actual protocol itself. All right, and so you can see here, this lets you know what you need to gather. Now, not everything is going to tell you that. Not all lab protocols are going to tell you what to gather, but some do. Okay? All right, safety precautions, very important. You are whole and hopefully healthy when you walk into the lab, and so we want you to be whole and healthy when you walk out of the lab. So it's really important to note those safety protocols. This particular protocol had some pretty gnarly stuff that we worked with. And so in order to do this experiment, not only did you have to wear a lab coat and regular nitrile gloves, but we also had to wear a splash apron, a full face shield, and these extra gloves that came up to our elbows. All right. And so this is all important stuff that you want to take note of before you start the experiment. Okay. All right. Now here is the protocol itself. Okay, it's going to explain how you do the experiment. And there's a diagram there too that helps you figure out how everything's going to be set up. Okay, all right, and then we finish off that protocol. Okay, now some protocols will give you some sample data tables, some won't. This one did. All right, and so here you can see a data table where we had to fill out things like the current that we used, how long we did the experiment for, the mass before we started, the mass after we finished, things like that, all right? Now, sometimes when you prep a data table, it's going to just be raw data. Sometimes there will be places there for calculations. So notice on this here, we've got mass before, mass after, and then mass lost. How do you think we get that mass lost? We do a calculation, okay? So when we take this right here, these pieces of data that we need to take down, when we prep the lab notebook, what we're going to do is we're going to leave spaces for things like observations and for calculations. So again, we want to have everything in one well-organized spot that we can come back to later, okay? So first pass, we've read through the whole thing. Now, second pass, we start prepping the prelab. Now that we have an idea of what the experiment looks like, we can start working up our lab notebook. Okay, prep the prelab. Now, what are we looking at with this prelab? Well, typically, we're going to have a title, an objective, a background, the protocol, okay, safety hazards, and then blank data tables. Okay, now why do we prep our data tables before class? Well, in a teaching lab, we only have so much time, all right? And if you come in completely unprepared, you've never read the experiment, you didn't prep your lab notebook, you don't have your data tables ready to go, you are going to waste so much time doing all of that work in class when you should be doing your experiment, all right? Because if you come in unprepared and we get to the end of the lab period and you're going, hey, Professor Stanfield, I didn't finish my experiment. There's nothing I can do, all right? You can't stay late and you can't come back another time because you didn't come in prepared. So it's really important that you have everything ready to go before class, all right? This makes things so much smoother. It also is a safety issue too. If you've never read this before you come into class, well, let's say with this protocol had some pretty crazy safety equipment we had to wear, all right? Now, obviously in a pre-lab talk, that would be gone over, but if that's the first time you're hearing it, you're more likely to jump into something and forget all about that, all right? Having gone through the exercise of reading it and then writing it up, that's going to codify it better in your brain than if you're sitting in class at 8 o'clock in the morning, half asleep, still drinking your coffee, right? Trying to wake up and follow along with what I'm saying. All right, so you need to make sure that you have all of this ready to go so that you can come in, hear the pre-lab talk, know what questions to ask, and then get to work. Okay? So once you have all that, what does that lab notebook look like? All right, well, let me show you how I prepped mine. Okay, so here is the beginning of my pre-lab. So I've got, a title there, Experiment 1, Synthesis of Porous Silicon by Photoelectrochemical Anodization of N-type Silicon. Guess what? That's the exact title that I got from that lab protocol. It's okay to use the same title. It's also okay if you want to come up with your own title, but keep in mind that when you turn stuff like this in, somebody needs to grade it. So make sure the title is related to what you're actually doing. All right. I've got an objective there. So basically what I did is I looked at the objective that was in the lab protocol and then I summarized it. Same thing with the background. I looked at the background, I drew the diagram that was given in that background section, and then I summarized it. I did not write this word for word. All right. The important thing is that you are synthesizing the information. And if you just wrote copy word for word, you're not actually thinking about what all those words say. So it's important to summarize and synthesize that information. So do not write word for word, okay? Okay, summarize. So you synthesize the information in your own head. Okay? Summarize it. Same thing with the protocol. Now my procedure here is pretty detailed. Okay? But I still summarized it. I thought about what each step said before I wrote it down. Okay? And I also drew the diagram there so that I could reference that. Okay? And then we note any of our safety protocols there. Okay? All right, so that's the beginning of that. Now, here I have space for my blank data tables. Okay? Ready to go. I can walk in and do it. I've got a data table. I've got plenty of space underneath. Okay, so here we have the data table. And then I've got space for observations and calculations. Okay, observations are really important. It's not enough just to write down the numbers, but if you have to analyze the data later, you need to have observations. You need to make sure that you can go back and follow along. Okay, now the next page, notice that I have some interesting stuff written there. I've got, some spots to write some data down, but then I also have file name on thumb drive, okay? These two particular parts of the experiment required that we use instrumentation. Okay, now when we use instrumentation, we save a data file. And so I have space to write down stuff that I see on that particular piece of instrumentation. Like I've got space on the photoluminescence to write down this wavelength peak, all right? But then I also need to save the whole spectra. And so I have a space there for file name on the thumb drive. Okay, it's really important that you're able to track back the files that you save on instruments to the experiment that you have done, okay? So it's important. Okay, so it's important to track that data on your computer or your instrument back to your particular experiment. Okay, and so as you're doing these, you want to write down what the file name is. Not just generic stuff. Make sure that you can track it back to each individual run that you've done. There's 3 samples, so I'm going to have 3 different files. So I'm going to write down each of the file names so that when I go back to my thumb drive, I know what each of those files tracks to. Okay, same thing with the IR. Okay, we're going to measure, on an instrument. I'm going to take some notes about prominent things that I see in my spectra, but then I'm also going to have the file name on the thumb drive, and then notice that I have written down here, full spectra can be found on thumb drive and will be inserted into report. Okay, that's not just there to, tell a teacher, that's there for me to remember, oh yeah, I need to make sure that I have these spectra because they're going to be important in my report. Like, I don't want to just have written down, the wavelengths that I, see things at. I need to make sure that when I'm giving my report, I have those files because that's going to be part of the figures in my report. All right. Okay, and then we had a luminescence quenching measurement and a quantum yield measurement. Okay, these didn't have files that needed to be saved, so these just simply had spaces for each of the samples so that I could write down my observations. Okay, this is all done before class. Okay, before class. You have to be prepared to come in and work. You have to be prepared to ask questions after that pre-lab talk. Okay, this is not stuff that is done during class. This must be done before class. And in fact, if you were in one of my classes, you submit copies of this to me via our learning management system, which for every campus I teach on right now is Canvas. All right, so you submit copies of this. You image your lab notebook for me, and you submit this to me before class starts. So if class meets at 8 a.m. on Friday morning, this is turned in and the assignment is locked before class starts. All right. So typically if it's an 8 a.m. class, I'll have this locked the night before, okay? Because I want to make sure that you have done this and that you've gotten sleep. It's also important to get sleep before you come to the lab. Don't come to the lab having pulled an all-nighter because that's a dangerous situation, all right? So it's really important that this is done before class, okay? Right now, you've done the pre-lab. Now class happens. I've given my pre-lab talk and I've released you to work. What do you do with all this that you've prepared? Well, now you start to fill it out. Okay, so you can see I started to fill out my pages as I went through the different parts of the experiment. Now during class, the most important thing is to start with just the data, all right? Occasionally we will need to do a calculation midway through to check on something, but the vast majority of the time, don't worry about the calculations right away. Worry about getting the data down because you can always do calculations outside of class. You cannot do your experiment outside of class. All right. So during class, focus on data and observations, not calculations, unless otherwise instructed. Okay. All right. Okay. And so you can see that I put down, my masses, and then I had some observations there that, some things are related, and what did I do? So if you look here, what's going on right here? I wrote something down wrong. I accidentally wrote current when I went voltage. Can you still read current underneath my crossout? Yeah. When we make a mistake, and we all make mistakes, every one of us makes mistakes, okay? When we make a mistake, we just put a single line through it, and then we rewrite what we actually meant, or we rewrite the correction. Okay? But you have to be able to read that. Because one of the things with the lab notebook is outside of a teaching environment, these are technically legally binding documents. And if you obscure data, it looks like you're trying to falsify things. And so even when you make a mistake or you write something down wrong or you redo something later, you don't scribble it out. You just put a line or two through it like that so it's still legible underneath, and you just rewrite it. It's okay. You're not being judged on if you make a mistake or not. You're being judged on, can you record data properly? Okay, so you just put that line through it. Okay, so I've got some observations written down, and then I even made a little note to myself. I'm like, oh, did the right current run? Because my voltage overloaded. And so I'm not sure if I actually ran the 96 milliamps of current that I thought I had. Okay, I programmed it to run that, but then something overloaded. So did I really get that current? And so I made that note to myself, because these are things later when I go write up my lab report. Maybe I write it up a week later and I'm like, what? Oh, wait, what happened that day? Oh, crud, a whole week's happened. I've had like 16 other classes. You know, I had a physics lab and a bio lab and an English paper. And oh, what happened in chemistry? Oh, I remember because I wrote it down. Okay, so important to write those observations down. And then I started my calculations. Okay. Then on the next page, you can see that I've written down my file names. Oh, you can see too that I wrote a wavelength down wrong. Same thing, just put a line through it, rewrote it, no big deal, okay? So I had etched my samples on page 29, okay? So you can see down in the corner here, this is page 29. So I had these sample names. So I had JS, my initials, Jessica Stanfield, so JS, 29, page 29, sample A with the A. Makes it very easy. I can track it back exactly where I did the experiment. Okay, and so since I gave my samples names, when I gave my files names, I didn't switch to the new page number because I was dealing with the samples I had made on page 29. So my file name on my thumb drive, I had this JS29APL, the PL for photoluminescence. Okay, when I did the IR, same thing, JS29A IR for my IR. Now, I haven't written down, you know, my prominent bands or stuff there yet. I just quickly wrote down my file names. So in this particular setting, we had one IR for every student in the room to all share. All right, it's not a cheap instrument. And so in this case, I didn't have time to stand at the instrument and analyze all of my readouts that I was getting in that moment. I just had to take my readouts, verify that they looked okay, save them to the thumb drive, and then pull my stuff, move aside, and let the next student come in. All right, and so when I pull these up on my computer, now I can start recording down my prominent bands and things like that in my lab notebook. So sometimes when you're working with instrumentation, you'll be able to write down a good analysis as you go. But if you are in a busy, crowded teaching lab that doesn't have, you know, one FTIR for every student, you might end up having to do it this way, where you note down your file name and then you let the next student use it, and then you bring it up on your own computer later. Okay? All right, so that's basically how we record our data. So it's super easy and super smooth when you have everything prepared. And it's okay, mistakes happen. We all make them. You just put a line through it and you rewrite it. It's not a big deal, okay? You can see 3 times on 2 pages I made mistakes. We're all human, okay? All right, now, what if we have an open-ended experiment? What if we've given you something that is more open-ended and you kind of got to figure it out as you go? So you can see here, these are a few of the things that I was looking at here where, you know, 2 different days. So I've got a date there, I've got a title. So on, you know, the left-hand image, I have something that says flake affixing. So I wrote down some notes that one of my teammates had done some oxidizing of the flakes we were using. Another person did some drying. And so I wrote those notes down. And then I wrote out the steps that I needed to take to do my affixing. So I needed to prep something called PDMS, and I wrote down the recipe for prepping it. And then I wrote down how I wanted to prep my weigh boat, all right, so that I remembered later, because this is actually something that I ended up doing all summer. And so it's a really good thing that I kept a good record of how I did it, because I frequently had to go back to these things. And on subsequent pages later, I would write down, see protocol on page whatever this was. And then I would note down anything I had potentially changed from that previous page. All right. So you want to be able to track back all of this stuff. Okay. And then I had notes. As I did my affixing, I wrote down things that I noticed, like, how did they adhere? What did I see? Things like that. Observations. Because these notes right here help me refine this procedure later on during the summer. All right. So this was earlier on when I was still, we didn't know what we were doing with these. And if you notice, I have on here an asterisk, and I wrote, here, I'll put it here. I have this asterisk. I said goal, 50% useful versus 20%, because the previous run that I had done, only 20% of the devices that I made actually were useful. Okay, and so that's part of the whole process, is trying to figure out, well, all right, how do we refine this? And so sometimes you might have something open-ended. If you're in a first semester general teaching lab, your first several experiments will be completely prescribed out for you. But then we do start to make you think a little bit more. Okay, if you are going from like prep chem to first semester chem or to freshman chem, sometimes everything will be prescribed out, but we may interject one or two little things. So 98% of your protocol may be prescribed out, and then we might have a little note in there that like, okay, now that you've done this, figure this out. Okay, and so you want to write all that down. Don't wait till you get to class. Write it down. And it's okay if you update and make changes to it later too. Okay, so, I have on here, this seems to mix more smoothly than the 1 mil, 0.1 mil mix, because I had tried something else before, but then I tried it again and found something that worked better. And so I made a note of it. Okay, and then you can see here's another one where I was talking about the fact that I needed to take images of these flakes that I had adhered. I had some notes about, what my notes meant for somebody else looking at them later. I was taking camera images on a microscope, so I mentioned the camera settings I had, so you can see this right here. Okay, those are my camera settings. I had the ISO, the f-stop, so I could replicate it later. What I labeled them with, because I did hundreds of these things, and so each batch I would label with something in a different color, and I made a note of it. Okay, so all of this stuff goes in your lab notebook. Keep good notes. It's very important. Okay? All right. So let's think about that notebook before you're leaving lab. All right? So now that you've seen how we prep it all, okay, what do you need to think about before you walk out at the end of the class period? All right. Well, first thing you want to think about is make sure okay, this might seem like a, no-brainer, make sure all data is written down, but here's the thing. If you're working in partners, and you do sometimes, don't let your lab partner write stuff down and get it from them later. Okay, you won't get it from them later. I cannot tell you the number of times students have tried to slip out of lab without everything written down, and then I get an email from them 6 days later. Hey, Professor Stanfield, I'm trying to do my lab report, and my lab partner had my data, and I can't get a hold of them. There is absolutely positively nothing I can do. If they're not responding to you, they're not going to respond to me. So you should be recording data as you go. Do not have one person write it down and then you copy stuff later. You've got to make sure everything is there as you are going. Okay. Pair all files on thumb drives. Okay, as I was showing you with those file names, make sure it's all paired. Double check before you leave that you've actually done that. because that's another email that I get from students. Hey, Professor Stanfield, the lab report is due in an hour, and I'm not sure what I did with the data on my thumb drive or what any of these files are. Also, can't help you, and also if it's an hour before it's due, I'm probably not at my computer, okay? So make sure you have all of that, okay? Verify. Verify that you have the title of the experiment on each page. That way when you're flipping back through it later, you're not like, what is this page for, okay? Verify you have a title on each page. Sometimes it's continuous and it looks like everything's together. And sometimes when you prep your notebook, you might not remember to put the title at the top of each page, but you want to make sure before you leave that everything you've done that day, because that's the thing too, is sometimes you may go on to extra pages. This definitely happens when there's labs with lots of observations where you prep 6 pages, but then you go on to a 7th or 8th page. And so you want to make sure that you have the title of the lab, even if it's just something quick and easy like experiment 1, so that way you can track back to it later and you're not going through your notebook going, what are these extra pages for? Okay, so verify you have the titles on each page. Okay. Get signed off by your instructor. Okay, I'm going to check your data before you leave. Most instructors will. We do this partially for number 1, to make sure all the data is written down. I've caught so many students trying to slip out without everything written down, and I make them sit down and do it because I am not kidding. Over the years, the number of emails I've gotten with, I don't have all my data written down. And so, because I don't know that I was as good at checking the data when I was a grad student and I was teaching labs. And so I'm a stickler for that. You got to have it all written down before you go. And I'm going to sign that off. And if it's not written down, I'm not signing off. And if I don't sign off, you lose points. All right. So make sure you have all your data written down. And then you're going to laugh at this one, but put your notebook okay, before you leave lab, make sure your notebook is in your bag. We get left notebooks all the time in teaching labs. And depending on the campus, like your instructors may not be there 5 days a week. And so it's not like, hey, professor, it's 11 o'clock at night. I don't have my lab notebook. Did I leave it in the lab? I don't know. I'm not there. I can't tell you. Okay, so you want to make sure that you put your notebook in your bag. This is something I see all the time. Okay, now just some general final considerations on your notebook. Okay, put your name on it. Put your name on it. Okay, that way if you do leave it, we can track it back to the right person. Okay, no spiral notebooks. Okay, you want to make sure that the pages can't be removed. Now, a lot of teaching labs will have you buy lab notebooks that have like a carbon page that can be pulled out, but they still have a like a page that can't be pulled out, and some of them are spiral. So when I say no spiral notebooks, I mean i.e. no regular. Okay, just no regular notebooks. It needs to be an actual like laboratory notebook. If it's a student lab notebook and it's spiral and it's got like the pull pages, that's fine because they're made for that. But it's better to have a book that is all one. Like this, you know, the way it's bound, okay, I can't pull the pages out. And that's what a standard lab notebook looks like. Okay, keep it organized. Okay, don't try to prep the entire semester's worth of lab report or pre-labs like in the first couple weeks of school and then realize, during lab 2 that the 6 pages you prepped really needed 8. And so now you're finishing lab 2 like 40 pages down the line. Okay, to keep it organized. Make sure that, you know, each experiment is staying together on that. Okay, don't remove pages. Now, if you are finding this from the general ether of the internet, you may be in a lab situation where you have one of those carbon page notebooks and your instructor tells you to remove the carbon pages before you leave class. Okay, that's going to be, you know, instructor dependent. If you're in my class, I just have you image the pages and upload them on Canvas. I will never have you remove pages from your lab notebook. So if you're in my class, you do not remove pages. If you make a mistake and you have to cross out a whole page, you just put a line through it and move to the next page. You don't pull the page out and pretend it never existed. Don't remove pages. Okay? All right, and then keep it legible. Okay, keep it legible. Make sure you can read it. Make sure I can read it. I mean, I don't have the greatest handwriting, but at least you can read it. Okay, make sure that it is legible and that people can read it. Okay, all right. So that is taking our protocol to our lab notebook and just general stuff about how we keep that lab notebook. Okay. And then just to finish off here, I just want to acknowledge that the information here was made possible through the NSF and my work at UC San Diego in the Materials Science and Materials Research Science and Engineering Center over the summer of 2025. The lab protocol that I use as an example here was one that was prepared by Dr. Mike Saylor, who was the PI of the lab that I had the pleasure of being in over the summer. So we always give credit as scientists.